SpawN is one of the most famous, most well-loved, most legendary CS 1.6 players of all time. And he's a player who even recently has even been doing some streaming in CSGO. And because his name is up there with like Heaton, Element, K-Sharp, those big names we think of from 1.6, Neo, Forest, it means that people are always fascinated with him and they always really hype him as like a great player. And if you ever see fans list like who's your top 10, who's your top 5 players of all time, he's going to be in a lot of people's top 5s, etc. Now, I have a different sense on him. I got to see this guy's whole career from the very beginning to the very end. And so I'm going to kind of lay out his career initially. Then I'll talk about some of his style. Okay, so way back in time, 2001, SpawN was playing in this team Matrix. And the famous thing about Team Matrix is that they were online as fuck. And the reason why is because they used to play from a LAN cafe called Matrix, and they used to have the best connection you could have in Sweden. This LAN cafe was in Stockholm. They used to be the guys who had like the 5 ping constant, amazing connection, and they would play from there. So what's funny is they were actually technically playing on LAN, but they were online as fuck. They were absolutely incredible. They used to use all the interp commands and all this and get every advantage you could. And here was the problem. They were so amazing online. They were using all these configs, etc., that when it came to the LAN tournaments, first of all, some of them would kind of just choke and crumble a bit, like online players often do. But secondly, some of them just weren't as good, and clearly some of that stuff helped. And also the other great teams, the other great Swedish teams, Game Online and IP, got a boost. Nordic Division got a boost when it came to those LAN qualifiers and would be better than them. So they were struggling around this time to even be considered a top 3 team within Sweden itself. At the time, SpawN also wasn't considered the best player on this team. People like, well, Scream was the one that everyone always looked at. And by the way, yes, it's not a French player now in CSGO. There's a Swedish player who he stole the name from, even the exact way it's spelled. That guy was considered the star, the possible blooming talent who was going to come from that team and who did eventually go into NIP. It was understandable why he was picked up. SpawN wasn't actually a big name there. And then beyond that, you had other players who were good Cypher, good AWPer. Now, in terms of this team, 2001, not a lot happened for SpawN here. Like just the Matrix team going into 2002. 2002, Matrix went to a LAN, CPL Oslo in Norway. They did really badly there. They never got a top placing at all. Again, they were just considered a bust. They were LAN failures. Now, his break came in Team 9 at the end of 2002, where he got to go to CPL Winter event of 2002, which was one of the majors in America. And this Team 9 team had Arl, who'd been on NIP before. It had players who would be on future SK Gaming teams. It had Fisker. And so this was a good team. It was a good quality. It was like the second best team within Sweden at the time, or maybe even the best. Actually, let me think. Yeah, it was probably the best overall at the time, because until SK Gaming had that result at this tournament where they outplaced them, people would have probably put it on Team 9, who'd been MTWSC before, because before they'd got SpawN, they had finished like second at a CPL qualifier and at CPL Oslo. And so they probably would overall have been considered the best Swedish team going into that tournament. At this tournament, they actually only managed to finish 4th, but it was a pretty stacked tournament, so it's still a pretty reasonably good result. So finally, got a good international result there. 2003, that team fractures a bit. SK Gaming makes it more, what at the time was considered an all-star lineup, like some of the players from that team going over there. A new Team 9 exists, which was the Esports United team of Vessler and those guys. SpawN doesn't get into this team. Initially, that team goes to the Vessel's ESU team goes to the Swedish Esport League, this internal LAN league, the Season 1 finals, and they win the league. But actually, it's Matrix, because SpawN's back in Matrix with some of those guys. It's SpawN and Matrix that come second. I think they came second. That had a really impressive showing, though. They came second or third, and basically one of the gimmicks of this LAN was a lot of the POV demos got released, because back then POV demos from LANs weren't released. They weren't even recorded, in fact. And he went completely ham in some of these games. I remember there was a Cobble game where he went nuts and got like 23 frags or something on CT side. Just really skilled. And so this was a way for people who already knew he was good from demos before to see like, wow, this is on LAN versus some of the best players in the world, legendary other players. And he was going ham completely. And actually in the next period, this Esports United / it would later become Adrenaline team of Veslin, there was a time when the rumour was behind the scenes, because they were trying a lot of different players out, that he was one of the names they were considering, or they tried a little brief amount of time, but he never got picked up for that. And he went to ESWC with this mixed team of players, including some players who used to be in the Eolithic lineup, the Norwegians. It didn't go well, and so that was just a bust completely. Now, towards the end of the year, this is where he got his big break, because SK Gaming became the best team in the world. They won CPL summer event in dominant fashion. They'd got Element, who at the time was the best player in the world, or at least the most efficient player in the world, the biggest impact player. He was just reading the game. He was the in-game leader. It was just incredible. They were never going to lose. But their problem was they couldn't use Element for 2 events. They couldn't use him for World Cyber Games because he was Norwegian. They needed a 5th Swedish player. And they couldn't use him for CPL Copenhagen because he had exams. So they brought in SpawN as like a ringer. He was like the ultimate super sub, if you want to use football terminology, because he was a star-level talent, but he was just going to be the sub in theory. Now, he came in for both those events. They won both events in dominant fashion. They didn't lose a map at either. They dominated CPL Copenhagen. They wrecked the WCG. They went absolutely ham. Like barely any teams. I think there's like 2 maps or something where teams got over like 8 rounds against them. They just dominated completely. So he'd done amazingly already. CPL Winter, there was some illness in terms of ALS, so they brought him in again, and they won that event in dominant fashion. Didn't lose a map in that tournament. And so this is part of one of the all-time great lineups. And then because of some of these issues they had, they decided, right, we'll bring him in permanently. Like, he's shown his worth. He's a really great player. And so at this time, he was one of the best players in the world. Definitely top 10, maybe even top 5 at this time, how good he was. But within that team, he wasn't the best player. Now, going forwards, 2004, SK was still a primary force, but Element had left. They finished second at CPL Summer. They lost to the Eyeballers team that was Hyper and Vilden, those guys. End of 2004, it didn't go so well. He had to skip the WCG and they had to bring in Al because he got ill, and so that didn't go well. They did badly. He wasn't playing there. They didn't get to go to the winter event that year because of contract negotiation breakdown between SK. So 2005, they make this NIP team, which was like a superstar all-star lineup. That does really badly initially, and then importantly, a bunch of the players, most of them, wanted to break off and not play with Heaton and some of the other guys in NIP anymore. So that set of people went back to SK, and they made this SK gaming team, which in the summer went to the CPL summer event, which actually was very understacked in talent because all the good talent had gone to ESWC, which was being held on clashing dates. They won this event, which is impressive. And then for the winter event, now here's the interesting one, because actually for WCG they hadn't qualified, they'd been upset by Speedlink, but for the winter event of this year, it's probably the most stacked CPL event ever, one of the most stacked events in the history of Counter-Strike 1.6, and SK Gaming wins the event without dropping a map. They win it in a really impressive fashion against an incredible field, and SpawN was probably the MVP of that tournament. And again, this is one of the first CPLs that had POV demos, so again we got to see how great he played there, and they win that event, one of the best wins ever. So yeah, that was a very, very legit win, and it's understandable why at that point his popularity and his name and persona is going to explode in terms of fan base. 2006, SK had some problems early on, and he got to go as a stand-in. I can't remember what the reasoning was, but he got to go as a stand-in to NIP, which was their rival again that had Heaton and all those guys in. But now this was a really good lineup they had, where they went on this run where they won all these tournaments, and they were probably the best team of the year at time. You know, they were probably the best team of the year overall. What's funny though is people forget this. SpawN wasn't actually involved in all the wins that they had. They had some of their wins before he came in. They had some of their wins with Heaton. Now he came in when they won the first NGL1 season. They won Code 5, and then they got a silver medal at WCG, and they were favoured to win that. But that was when the Poles first came up and won their first major, so understandable. But they were favoured to win that tournament. 2007, he goes back to SK. They have this miracle win at the Samsung European Championship, which is sort of like the WCG of Europe. That was like a miracle win. No one even knows how that happened. Their team should not have done that. And then they finished second at WSVG Land War behind Lurpus's Finns. Not actually that impressive a performance. That was when the top end of the scene was a bit fractured and still figuring itself out. And then later on in 2007, all these top teams would get it together and become truly elite again. And so around the end of the year was when they got Tentpole into the team, they got Robban into the team from NIP and teams like this, and so they managed to make this really sick SK gaming lineup, which was, yeah, it was behind Fnatic, who were the dominant team, and it lost, so they finished like second at IEM Los Angeles, and they got second at DreamHack Winter behind an MIBR team that was just like an inspired run. 2008 was when SpawN was starting to be nudged out, because clearly SK needed something to change to be getting back to winning ways, because now they weren't even placing top 2, they were like third and they were bombing out earlier. So they tried removing SpawN for the IEM2 season finals, and they brought in GetRight, who was a young blossoming star. That didn't go so well, didn't work out so well. So actually they brought SpawN back, but then he sort of retired towards the end of the year. It was all a mess, and then we didn't hear from him for like a year and a half. Then he came back for WCG 2009 and played in Threat's team, this Swedish lineup that went there. I forget what the name of that team, I think it was H2K actually. And their problem was they played against the Poles in the first round of the playoff, the round of 16, and they lost in 3 maps, close series, but no one remembers. And the Poles went all the way and won the gold medal that year, and so no one even remembers that that's what actually happened to SpawN for that tournament. So that was the end of his 1.6 career. Now in terms of, now you can see there, he had some good periods, he's had a lot of success over that time period, but there's always caveats and there's always context to it. It's not the same as just being like Neo and then you're winning everything and you're the main reason all the time. It's obviously the best player ever. You know, it's not like that sort of a scenario. In terms of his style and skills, one thing that always stood out, he had amazing spray. In fact, in the history of 1.6, in terms of spray, he would be up. He's definitely top 5 in terms of spray all time, maybe even top 3. Really, really good spray, particularly with the Colt. Unreal spray with the Colt. There's a famous clip on Inferno against Mouse Sports where he kills all 5. It's like, even to this day, it's unreal if you watch it. Of elite level riflers, which he was, he had a really good AWP. Now, people often used to think of him as an AWPer and talk about him as a primary AWPer. He wasn't exactly, but then again, he wasn't also just one of those guys like an execute who just used the AWP every now and then. I'd say he was like a hybrid. Like, he was one of the true hybrids, like, could use the AWP whenever he wanted. I admittedly used it a lot in frag movies, which is why people overblew his AWPing. Could use it whenever he wanted, but was mainly a rifle player, mainly a spray rifle player. He had really good pistols. His deagle was unreal. His USP really strong as well, although he did spam it a bit too much. He could have been a bit more accurate. He was just one of the most skilled players ever. There's no doubt about that. Talented and skilled, yes. One of the best absolute ever, top 5 of all time. Aggro style that fans love to watch. Aggressive, wants to, very aim duel heavy style. Always taking aim duels, always trying to out aim, always trying to power over the opponents. And so when it worked, that would be a really great style. It would be dominant to watch. But it also could really fuck up a game for you. There wasn't so much smart, there wasn't so much cerebral play to SpawN's approach, you know. He was a pretty good clutch round player. Oftentimes, a lot of those beast racking up 30 frag guys aren't actually that clutch. He was decently clutch. He wasn't super clutch, but he would have certain rounds when he could do stuff. The problem with SpawN was he was overhyped due to point of view demos that were really sick and releasing a lot of them. Frag movies that he had a couple that were pretty good and showed off skills, but a lot of it was in like gathers and stuff. So he was just owning guys who actually weren't on the level of elite players, and also just fan base. Like he was the next guy to get that sort of heat and shine where your fans are so rabid and bringing you up all the time as the best that even in times when you're not, they're just still talking about you and blowing you up way beyond compared because they love you as a player so much and they think you're so great, and when they see you at your best you look so amazing that they forget the games that aren't as high impact. The key context about SpawN's career to know is that in all these years he played from 2001 to 2009, the only year where he was not only on the best team in the world, like a world championship level team, but also was the best player on that team and as a result the best player in the world and the carry for his team. The only time when he was the #1 obvious main carry was 2005 in that SK Gaming Sweden lineup that had Al, Vilden, Sniden and Fisker. That lineup, he was the main carry, he was the star. I'd say at the end of the year he was the best player in the world. He had the most all-around game, the most game impact, he was dominant, he was the MVP of CVL Winter 2005 for me. Yeah, he was the best player at this point in time. And Zet hadn't fully gotten to his level he would the next year, but that's the thing. The other years, okay, so 2002, he still had some issues on LAN performance, so I wouldn't say he was like by far the best player on those teams he was on, although 2003 he was getting pretty sick on the Matrix team, but then he comes over to the SK, which is the team that had the chance to be really good, and he wasn't necessarily the best player in that team actually. Element had the most game impact, Potty was probably the best player in terms of technical abilities and what he could do closing a game. SpawN was a good one, he was up there was some contesting between them who was the best, but he wasn't a clear-cut MVP of the team, whereas in the past Potty had been, Heaton had been the best at one point in time, Element at different points, you know, all these other players that had their periods as the dominant best player. In terms of the 2004-2005 teams, okay, like I've said, 2005, yeah, he was the best for SK, but you go beyond that, NIP. This NIP team that won all those tournaments, like I said, he wasn't even involved for all the wins. You can't give him all the credit for that as though he was like the reason they won them all. No, they'd already been winning before then. He came on board as the stand-in. I actually would say in that team, clear-cut the best player was actually Zet. Zet was amazing that year. That was a breakout, one of the best, most dominant years ever. So SpawN was a second solid or third player there, but he wasn't the best. In 2007, going into 2008, the problem now is, yes, during the times when they won those upset wins, he was the best because their team was pretty poor and they had a lot of problems and they were struggling to get the top talent because Fnatic and NIP existed and these other teams, etc. But when the team got successful again with that run they had at the end of the year going into early 2008, the problem there was the best player in that team was Tentpole. He was the all-round player, he was the dominant player, he was the best. This was his prime, even though they didn't win that many events, they just had top placings, you know, and he would go on to prove it over 2008, over 2009, he was the best player in that team. He was a really, probably one of the most underrated players ever actually, Tentpole. 2009, when he came back, first of all, it wasn't a great team. It was just an okay team. He wasn't the best player in it either. They had some other good players, Crystal, those sorts of... Actually, Crystal wasn't in that team for that particular one. I think he'd already gone over to SK Gaming. The players they had, they had Zneil. He was probably better at the time, actually, because SpawN was on his comeback. So SpawN's problem is, he is a great player, and he's had great play throughout all these different years and different successes and a lot of medals and a lot of top placings. But it's hard to give him the same credit that you give to a Neo or a Forest or a Potty in the early days, or Execute in the very early days, or Element during his prime, 2002, 2003. Because these players, some of them have different qualities that are more so, and they were more the main carry. They were more the best player in the world. It was more clear cut that they were the best. SpawN was the best player at a certain period in time, 2005. Then he was like a top 2 or top 3 player, and he was a great player in other aspects, but he had help, and he was in the right place, and he had the right opportunities, and he had the right teammates, and he had the right success level that goes along with it. But you don't give someone the same weighting for a gold medal if they were like the second best player as if they were the primary main carry who was dominant in that sense. That person gets more of the credit for that when you're weighing up overall accomplishments and who's the greatest player. So yes, he's one of the greatest players ever. How great? Now that's something I'd have to debate and put into my own top 10 list. I'm not sure if he would actually make my top 10. It might be debate. He'd be at the bottom end of it, put it that way. Maybe he'd be top 15. Top 20, I'm pretty sure he'd be in there. You'd have to see where I'd place overall. But it's not as clear-cut as the fans and the movie and the history might tell you, that might say, oh, he's definite top 5. Not really, actually. There's some debate can be had there. But he was a great player, and you shouldn't take anything away from his career overall. He was definitely an excellent player. It's just when you're talking about balancing the elite players out, a lot of them had some qualities and some aspects to their career that he didn't overall, even though his career deceptively might have appeared it had that, and even more so because of the longevity, the number of placings, the great skill level, obviously. So that's who SpawN was.